In 1992, Russia sold China one of its best fighter jets in the world, T. China took it apart, copied it, and told Russia it no longer needed them. In this video, I'll explain how this decision by China led to the consequential betrayals in modern arms trade history. In the early 1990s, Russia was not in a position to be choosy. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, the economy was in free fall, and the defense industry that had once competed toe-to-toe with the United States was now struggling to pay its own workers. Engineers who had spent their careers designing world-class weapons were taking second jobs just to survive. In that environment, a billion-dollar offer from China was nothing but a lifeline. In 1992, China spent approximately $1 billion to acquire around 24 Su-27s, becoming the first country outside the former Soviet bloc to receive the aircraft. The Su-27 was no ordinary plane. It was a fourth-generation air superiority fighter, highly maneuverable, long-ranged, and capable enough to seriously threaten anything NATO had in the air. Handing it to China was a significant decision, but Moscow justified it on economic grounds. Russia needed the money, China needed the capability, and both sides, at least on paper, needed each other. China tested the jets, flew them hard, and came back for more. But this time, they wanted to build the aircraft themselves. A deal was reached in 1996, which was of about $2.5 billion. The 200 Chinese planes would be assembled in Shenyang Aircraft Corporation as a licensed assembly. The aircrafts would be called J-11s. By this, China undertook to not re-export the aeroplane, and Russia withheld the most secretive of these, namely the avionics, radars, and engines which would remain imported directly out of Russia instead of manufactured domestically. Moscow believed it had constructed a clever arrangement, but it had not thought through what China could do with the parts it was allowed to touch. Production began in 1997, and the early results were not encouraging. The first two J-11s, completed in December 1998, were poorly assembled and required Russian engineers to come in and essentially rebuild them. But China learned fast. By the beginning of the 2000s, the situation had changed dramatically, and Chinese engineers were already integrating airframe components made locally without any serious concerns expressed by Moscow. Russia, in its turn, was unwilling to accept Chinese pressure to modernize the avionics package and only yielded to it to a rather small degree of radar enhancement. The relationship was tense but functional, and 100 aircraft were assembled under the original arrangement. Then, in 2004, China cancelled the rest of the contract. The stated reason was straightforward enough. Chinese officials said the Su-27 no longer met their operational requirements. They wanted fighters capable of delivering precision-guided munitions, and the existing design did not satisfy that demand. Russia accepted the explanation. The contract was terminated, money changed hands to settle outstanding obligations, and Moscow moved on. The next thing that occurred came after a period of 3 years. The J-11B was introduced by the Shenyang Corporation in 2007. It resembled the Su-27 SK almost the same. It was similar in aerodynamics, almost had the same weapons, had modern avionics, and a locally made radar. It was flying without a single Russian component and without a single yuan paid to Russia in licensing fees. China had used the entire licensed production period to study, disassemble, analyze, and replicate the aircraft. The cancellation in 2004 had not been a business decision. It had been a conclusion. China had learned everything it needed to know. Russian engineers and Sukhoi officials recognized what they were looking at immediately. The airframe geometry, the structural design, the system's architecture, all of it bore the unmistakable fingerprints of their own work. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. China had reverse-engineered the Su-27 in its entirety and then walked away from the contract the moment the knowledge transfer was complete. The refusal by Russian engineers and technicians to provide any further assistance, support, or cooperation, not bureaucratic foot-dragging. It was the only coherent response available to people who had watched their life's work be stolen and repackaged under a foreign flag. The one place where China's copy fell apart badly was the engine. Its initial armament was a domestically manufactured WS-10A Taihang turbofan, which had alarming results. The engines were taking more than 30 hours of airtime to execute overhaul. As a reference point, the Russian AL-31F that it was to replace had a service life of approximately 400 hours between overhauls. The quality control of WS-10A became so bad that the number of engines returned to the factory exceeded those leaving it. The J-11Bs were forced to put at least some of their fleet on ground and re-equip them with the Russian engines that China had attempted to substitute. In a silent manner, it was justice. China had managed to clone the body of the plane but failed to duplicate its heart. This dependency gave Russia a narrow but real form of leverage, and it shaped how Moscow chose to respond. Rather than severing the relationship entirely, which would have been economically devastating given that China accounted for nearly 40% of Russian defense exports in those years, Russia shifted strategy. The goal became selling completed products and critical components without transferring the knowledge to produce them. Engines, in particular, became the choke point. Russia understood that advanced propulsion technology was the one domain where China consistently struggled and where reverse engineering carried the highest degree of difficulty. The metallurgy required for high-performance turbine blades, the precision tolerances involved in building components that spin at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute under extreme heat, these are not problems that can be solved simply by taking a working engine apart and measuring what you find. China had tried that approach and produced an engine that disintegrated on a schedule that made it nearly unusable in operational conditions. If you keep the engine proprietary and unsolvable, you keep the dependency alive indefinitely. The J-11B was not a one-time incident. It was part of a pattern that Russian officials eventually began documenting openly and with visible frustration. Rostec's chief of intellectual property projects stated publicly that there had been 500 cases of unauthorized copying of Russian equipment abroad over a 17-year period, with China specifically cited for copying aircraft engines, Sukhoi jets, carrier-based fighters, air defense systems, portable, surface-to-air missiles, and analogs of the Pantsir close-in weapons system. The J-15 carrier-based fighter, which China now operates from its aircraft carriers and uses in Taiwan Strait operations, was derived from a Su-33 prototype that China acquired from Ukraine in 2001 after Russia had refused to sell the Su-33 directly. Beijing had simply gone around the refusal by sourcing the airframe through a different channel. The pattern was not coincidental or opportunistic. It was methodical, patient, and executed across multiple platforms over multiple decades. Russia's response evolved slowly, but it did evolve. Military-to-military exchanges on technical cooperation were suspended between 2006 and 2008. The halt was not announced with fanfare. Russia did not issue public condemnations or file formal international complaints. The suspension was quiet and deliberate, a signal sent through absence rather than confrontation. In December 2008, Russia and China signed an intellectual property agreement restricting Beijing from exporting arms derived from Russian designs, though it left a significant gap by not preventing domestic production. Russian officials warned privately that any export of the J-11B or its derivatives to third countries would be met with legal action, the concern being that Chinese knockoffs would undercut Russian aircraft in the global arms market. A Russian deputy director at Sukhoi reportedly put it plainly when asked about China's copy: making a good quality replica of a spoon is one thing. Making one of a combat aircraft is something else entirely. When negotiations for the Su-35 eventually resumed years later, Russia drove a hard bargain and deliberately limited the number of aircraft sold, specifically to prevent China from acquiring enough frames to complete another systematic reverse engineering exercise. The number settled on was 24, carefully calibrated to be useful to Beijing as an operational fleet while being insufficient as a study sample. The long-term consequences of the J-11 affair shaped Russian arms export policy in ways that are still visible today. Russia no longer licenses complete systems. It no longer transfers manufacturing knowledge. It parcels out components strategically, keeps propulsion technology close, and builds dependency into every major deal rather than allowing clients to build self-sufficiency. The 2014 Ukraine crisis accelerated the reset in Sino-Russian relations and pushed Moscow toward greater cooperation with Beijing out of geopolitical necessity. But the lessons of the Su-27 remained embedded in how Russia structured every subsequent transaction. The planes made by China without authorization are now making combat patrol in some of the most disputed airspace in the world. The J-11B and the J-15 are frontline resources in the Chinese ambition to control the South China Sea and exercise muscle over the Taiwan Strait. They were built using knowledge that Russia transferred in good faith as part of a commercial deal, and they now serve as instruments of a foreign policy that Russia has no influence over. Russia's engineers refused to return China's Su-27 because by the time they understood what had happened, there was nothing left to return. The aircraft had already been taken apart, studied down to the last rivet, and rebuilt under a different name on a different production line in a different country. What began as a commercial transaction in a time of desperation had ended as a strategic miscalculation with consequences that stretched far beyond a single aircraft program. Moscow had sold access, received money, and lost something far more valuable than either: the certainty that its most advanced military technology would not be turned against its own interests. That is a lesson Russia has spent the years since trying to make sure it never has to learn twice. What do you think of China's act towards the contract with Russia? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting videos like this. Thank you for watching till the end, and we'll see you in our next one.